Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what happens with Clouds. Clouds is another complex digital module. It actually has 4 different basic functionality modes. At the moment we're in mode 3, which is a looping delay. And the blinky lights just show you the input level to make sure you're not clipping. And I'm sending a CV to the freeze input from this sequencer, this trigger source down here. When this goes on, that light goes on and it loops. And I did actually tune the length of the loop by hand, I think. Or no, it's synced, I think. Anyway, when I turn this up, it's going to add reverb to it. Now we're listening to the same basic sound as before. So we can get a little bit of ambience out of that. But the other thing is that this signal, the input to Clouds, is coming from the filter, not from the enveloped VCA. So if I take this up here, now we have that more stuttery kind of quality sound.
Cool.
And I could totally mess with this by messing with the knobs, because this mode is not really well documented, and I don't want to touch it. I want to leave it the way it is.
Right.
So the fourth thing that's going on in this patch, as you can tell, it's not in tune with anything else at the moment. We're taking the B output from this sequencer, and it's running over into the DPO, which is an analog oscillator, and there's no quantizer in there. I do have a couple of quantizers, but I'm not sure they work very well, so I'm just not using them. The DPO has all kinds of controls of its own. At the moment, let's see, we're getting some linear FM from a synced oscillator here.
And hearing that squelchy sick sound.
Yep. Now the output of that, which is rather ugly at the moment, and I would never want to use this in a production, but for purposes of illustration, this is what we've got. The output of that is going through the it's the Rossum Morpheus filter, which at the moment I happen to be in a preset called Tension Wire, and it's being enveloped from, let's see, it's getting an envelope from back up here in this envelope generator. So if we could turn this off, we'll center that knob.
And that filter is the Z-plane technology that Dave Rossum developed for EMU.
Right. Except that it's much further along, because when he did the EMU Morpheus synth module, he could only modulate one of the filter axes in real time, because the digital technology was not fast enough at the time to do that. This one can modulate all 3 axes of the filter in real time from control voltages or from your knobs. And that's why there's a cube up here in the LCD, the cute little multicolor LCD. There's a cube there, and when I turn one of these knobs, if you look really close, you'll see the little dot in the cube.
I don't know, my autofocus is going to handle it.
The little dot in the cube is going to move around.
There it is.
There's the dot in the cube. And he also gives you an approximation of the filter response curve at the bottom.
Yep, I see it. So
you can get lost in this thing. I mean, you can spend days messing around with it. It also has sequences of filters. If I wanted to, I could hook a clock up here and step through a sequence of arbitrarily chosen filter presets. Depending
the preset itself can be a target, a destination for being modulated.
Right. Yeah. So that you can, and I think I seem to recall that there's a morph time in there too, so that it will morph smoothly from filter A to filter B to filter C and then back to A, depending on how you program your filter sequence, so that every note of the sequence could have a slightly different or radically different tone color. So that's a pretty radical module. And we're doing something not very interesting with it at the moment. And the output of that module, which comes, it's on this purple cable here, is being run through the quad VCF VCA from Sputnik, which is at the moment it's in low pass gate mode. It can be either a filter or a gate, VCA, or the combo mode, which is a low pass gate. If I switch it to VCA, now it changes the sound slightly because it's no longer rolling off the highs as the envelope closes. And the output of the combo mode here, we'll shorten this a little bit, is going into the Rainmaker digital delay. And at the moment it's totally dry, so you're not hearing it.
There we go.
Or I could go totally wet and turn up the delay feedback.
That's how everything sounds all together now.
Yeah, it's kind of mushed together. There's your dry sound. Well, let's say we want a little bit of delay feedback. Now we're going to cause this to pitch shift. The dry sound is the original pitch.
It's a totally different character.
Oh yeah. And this thing also has a comb filter in it, which I seldom use because it's hard to control. I just haven't learned it. I'll turn that back where it was. So that's what's going on with the EMU and the digital delay coming from the DPO. And that's just one of the signals here. And I'm not going to try to tune that again. I mean, it's not in tune with the rest, so let's just turn it off. There you go. So that's basically what's going on in this patch. I skipped a few things, but I think you get the idea. There's an enormous amount that you can do to control various things in various ways. And so if you have specific questions, please don't email me.
You can email me.
Yeah, email Steve.
I'll ask you.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a couple of other aspects of the hardware that might be interesting for you to know about. These cases are made by Depfer, and I knew that I was never going to take the system on the road, so I didn't need the type of cases that have, a latching lid, with the padding or anything. And I didn't want to spend a lot of money on the cases because I wanted to spend the money on the modules. And so these are just the cheap plywood Depfer cases. And they work really well. But I did want this kind of tiered effect so that things could be performed a little more easily rather than having everything vertical. And I've gradually built the system up by adding another case and then adding another case. One of the things that people need to know about, of course, with modular is the power supply requirements. Anytime you've got a bunch of modules in the case, you need to check and read the manual for each of them and then add up the amount of power that each of them requires and make sure you're not overloading the power supply. Now, when I first bought this case, you'll observe that this case has 3 tiers instead of 2. This is an older Depfer case, and it has the same power supply as the cases that have only 2 tiers. And the result of that was that it's underpowered. And I noticed at some point that one of my digital modules would periodically reset itself because it wasn't getting enough electricity. And that's why I bought the Yuzu's power supply over here. So some of these modules are actually getting their power from the Yuzus rather than from the case. This, however, is a new Deptford case with a more beefy power supply. All the stuff in here is getting its power from the case itself. Some of these modules, however, require a 5-volt power supply, which is not the Eurorack standard, but some of the digital modules want to get a 5-volt power for some reason to do with their chip or whatever. So several of these cases have a little 5-volt thing that you plug in on the power rail. If you zoom in here, you can see the power rail and in that gap there. That's where you plug in the separate modules. And I'm not going to pull out a bunch of stuff to show you one of these little 5-volt thingies, but you plug that in and then you make sure that you plug the braids into the rail that has the 5-volt power supply so that you don't run out of, so it won't run otherwise. So that's one of the things about the case that it is good to know. There was something else I was going to
Monomi. The Monomi.
Yes. Oh, yes. Here we have, this is kind of cool. This is, is it pronounced Monomi? I just say Monome. But this is 3 modules in one, and this is 3 control surfaces in one. What we have here is, this is the splitter, and the keyboard, the touch plate, is connected to the splitter, and then there are 2 USB outputs and 3 modules. So at the moment we're getting, it's a keyboard. It's not connected to anything. You can't hear it do anything. But if I switch this switch to the other position, instead of this, let's see, instead of this module, we'll get this module. And you will observe that suddenly it's a step sequencer. This is another very cool step sequencer. It has multiple patterns that can be of any length. It has probabilities. It has 4 outputs, and you can have one of these be less likely to occur at random, and so on and so forth. So that's a very interesting piece of sequencing gear. There are other things in here that are just kind of cool and weird that I got at some point, and I thought, oh, that's cool and weird.
Is there an ergonomic strategy for what you put where? Or is that always just evolving?
I wish I had a good Washington, D.C. avoidance mechanism to not answer that question. Because the truth is that as it's gotten more complicated, it's harder and harder to do the ergonomics. That's why this cable is purple. It's a really long cable because sometimes you need to connect something here to something there, and there's just no good way to do the ergonomics in this system. Things that I use less often tend to migrate up and to the left, as you can see. Where this is part of the original system that I had when it was much smaller, except that I pulled some stuff out in order to add the multiband resonator and the Morpheus, and so those things moved elsewhere. But these guys have pretty much stayed. This is this weird little module. You see this? This is called a brain seed. I don't know if they even make this anymore, but it's a sample and hold that can be randomized so that you can have a 16-step random sequence and then press the button and it will repeat those 16 steps. And it's really cool, and I hardly ever use it. So, no, the ergonomics is just kind of work in progress, and that's why there's a screwdriver here, because sometimes you have to pull things out and move them somewhere else.
Most important piece of gear in the studio.
Oh, absolutely. And and this whole thing runs off of a barrier strip down there that has one switch, so I can turn it all off and on at one time. The cases have their individual power switches. Once in a while, one of the digital modules will become unhappy, and then you can just power off that one case and then power it back on, and the digital module is fine. Cool. So there's all kinds of little tricks that you learn for each module or for combinations of modules that the possibilities with a system like this are, I would say, literally infinite. But finding musical uses for them is sometimes a challenge.
Jim Aikin, thanks very much for showing us around and showing us the patch.
Dude.